The morning sun rose over the quiet streets of Montgomery, Alabama, painting the sky in soft shades of gold. A gentle breeze carried the hum of the city waking up, cars honking, people rushing, and doors of shops creaking open. Among the early crowd, a tall, frail old man walked slowly down the sidewalk, his clothes dusty, his hat worn out, and in his hand, a large brown sack. People glanced at him with mild curiosity. Some smirked. He looked like any other old man wandering the streets, someone life had long forgotten. But there was something different about his eyes, steady, calm, and proud. At exactly 9 a.m., he stopped in front of Montgomery First National Bank, the tallest building on the street. He looked at its glass doors, took a deep breath, and walked in. The guard frowned. "Hey, old man, this isn't a place for beggars," he said. The old man tipped his hat politely. "Son," he said in a calm, deep voice, "I ain't here to beg. I'm here to check on my bank." The guard blinked. "Your what?" "My bank," the man repeated. "I believe I own it." The laughter started immediately. A few customers turned around. One woman whispered, "Did he just say he owns the bank?" The teller at the counter laughed so hard she almost dropped her pen. "Sir," she said mockingly, "maybe you're lost. There's a soup kitchen 2 blocks away." The old man didn't flinch. He placed his sack on the counter and said quietly, "Call your manager. Tell him Henry Davis is here to see him." The teller raised an eyebrow. "Henry Davis? And who might that be?" The man looked her in the eye. "The man who saved this town when the bank was about to close 50 years ago." The laughter died down slightly, replaced by confusion. The teller, annoyed but curious, called her manager. Minutes later, a young man in a navy suit came out of his office, adjusting his tie. "I'm Mr. Reed, the manager," he said. "Can I help you?" "Yes," the old man said. "You can start by opening my account." Reed looked him up and down. "And which account is that?" The old man untied his sack slowly. Everyone leaned forward. From it he pulled out a stack of old documents, yellowed, fragile, sealed in wax. He placed them gently on the counter. "I kept every paper," he said. "From the day I helped build this bank. I sold my land, my farm, and my wife's gold to keep this place alive during the war. Your founders promised me shares, half the ownership written right there." Reed's smile faded. He picked up one paper and froze. It had the bank's old seal, signatures of the founders, and a date from 1904. The room went silent. The guard lowered his hand from his holster. Customers turned to stare. This can't be real," Reed murmured. "Where did you get this?" The old man smiled softly. "From the ground I tilled and the life I lived. You can verify it yourself, son. I've been waiting 50 years for the truth to matter." The manager excused himself, clutching the papers, and hurried into his office. 10 tense minutes passed. The old man stood quietly, looking out the window as laughter turned into whispers. Finally, Reed came back, pale and trembling. Behind him was the bank's regional director, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority. "Mr. Davis," she said slowly, "these documents are authentic. They prove you are indeed one of the original stakeholders of Montgomery First National Bank." The room went completely still. No one breathed. The same people who had laughed moments ago now stood in shock. The old man simply nodded as if he'd known all along. "So," he said softly, "can I finally see my bank records?" The manager's voice shook. Yes, sir." "Of course." As they led him to the private office, the teller who had mocked him earlier whispered to a coworker, "I can't believe it. He really owns the place." The old man turned slightly, looked at her, and smiled kindly. "Never judge a man by the dust on his shoes," he said. "Sometimes the richest hearts come wrapped in old clothes." And with that, Henry Davis, the man with the sack, walked into his own bank once more. The story of the old man spread through the city like wildfire. By noon, everyone in Montgomery had heard about the black man with the sack who claimed the bank. Some said he was crazy. Others whispered that he was a legend. The truth was somewhere in between, and soon everyone would know it. Henry Davis sat on the small wooden bench outside the bank. The brown sack rested beside him. He didn't look angry or proud. He just looked peaceful. For him, this was not revenge. It was remembrance. He had waited 50 long years for the truth to rise, just like the morning sun. Inside the bank, though, things were different. The manager, Mr. Reed, was pacing in his office, sweat forming on his forehead. The regional director, Mrs. Walker, sat behind the desk, her expression unreadable. "This could destroy us," Reed said in a low, tense voice. "If this man is really a half-owner, he can claim everything. He can even shut us down." Mrs. Walker leaned back in her chair, thinking deeply. "The documents are real," she said slowly. "But that doesn't mean we can't challenge them. He's old. He probably doesn't have the money for lawyers. We just need to make this disappear quietly." Reed nodded nervously. "What do you suggest?" She smiled coldly. "We'll invite him to a meeting tomorrow. Make him sign a settlement. A small amount, enough to keep him quiet. He'll think it's fair." They both knew what they were doing was wrong, but in their minds they were protecting the bank and their jobs. The next morning, Henry came back to the bank wearing the same worn-out hat and coat. The guard, who had laughed at him the day before, now opened the door with respect. "Good morning, sir," he said softly. Henry nodded. "Good morning, son." He was taken to a private office where Mr. Reed and Mrs. Walker were waiting. They greeted him politely and offered him coffee. The tone was very different this time. Gentle, respectful, almost too kind. "Mr. Davis," Mrs. Walker began, smiling warmly. "We've reviewed everything. It's truly remarkable what you did for this bank. You are a part of our history." Henry nodded slowly. "I'm glad you see that now." "Of course," she continued, sliding a paper across the table. "But you see, sir, times have changed. The laws, the ownership structures, they're not what they were back then. The bank is now owned by a board of investors. However," she paused and smiled, "we want to honor your contribution, so we've prepared a check, $25,000, as a token of appreciation." Reed placed the check in front of him. The numbers looked big. For a man who lived alone in a small house, it was more money than he had ever seen at once. But Henry didn't even look at it. He looked straight into Mrs. Walker's eyes. "You think I came here for money?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Walker blinked. Well, we just thought—" Henry's voice was calm but firm. "When I gave my land to this bank, I didn't do it to get rich. I did it so that the people of this town, black, white, poor, rich, could have a place to keep their savings. A place that would survive even after I'm gone. That was the promise." Reed shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Walker's smile faded. Henry gently pushed the check back. "I don't want your money," he said softly. "I just want the truth to be known. My wife died believing that our sacrifice was forgotten. I came here today so her spirit can rest." The room went silent. Mrs. Walker swallowed hard. For a moment she saw not a poor old man but a giant of faith and integrity. But her greed returned quickly. "I understand, Mr. Davis," she said with forced calmness. "However, to make things official, we'll need your signature here. It's just a small legal matter, confirming your understanding that this payment settles all ownership claims." Henry's sharp eyes looked at the paper. He might have been old, but he wasn't blind, neither to the words nor to their intentions. He picked up the document and read it slowly, lips moving slightly as he whispered each line. Then he chuckled softly. "You're clever people," he said, looking at them kindly. "But not wise." Mrs. Walker frowned. "Excuse me?" Henry stood up, straightening his back. "You think I walked all this way without knowing what I'd face? I may not wear a suit, but I have friends who do. Lawyers. Old friends who never forgot what I did for this town. I already gave them copies of these papers last night." Reed's face went white. "You what?" Henry smiled gently. "You see, when a man carries truth in his hands, he doesn't walk alone." He picked up his sack, tipped his hat, and walked out of the office. The sound of his steps echoed through the marble floor. Mrs. Walker sat frozen. "He outsmarted us," she whispered. Reed buried his face in his hands. "We tried to cheat the man who built this place. God help us." Outside, Henry looked up at the blue sky. He smiled softly to himself and whispered, "Martha, my dear, they can't hide the truth anymore." The wind blew gently, lifting a few leaves off the ground, as if carrying his words to the heavens. That night, the story of Henry Davis, the man with the sack, reached the local newspaper. The headline read, "Bank Founder Returns After 50 Years, Exposes Hidden Truth." And that was just the beginning of what was to come. The next morning, the city of Montgomery woke up to shock. The headline of every newspaper read in bold letters, "Old Black Man Claims Half Ownership of Montgomery First National Bank. Proof Found." People gathered at coffee shops, bus stops, and barber stores to talk about it. Some didn't believe it. Others said it was about time someone stood up to the big banks. And in the middle of that storm sat Henry Davis, calm as ever, drinking tea on his front porch. He wasn't looking for fame. He never had. But deep inside he knew one thing. The truth had to be seen by everyone, not buried in dusty vaults. By noon, a black car stopped outside his little house. Out stepped a well-dressed man in a gray suit holding a leather briefcase. "Mr. Davis?" the man asked politely. Henry nodded. "Yes, sir. And who might you be?" "My name's Robert Collins," the man said with a warm smile. "I'm a lawyer. I read your story in the paper. My grandfather used to tell me about you. Said you were the only man who helped keep this town alive during the old bank crisis." Henry's eyes softened. "Your grandfather must have been George Collins," he said quietly. "He was a good man, honest." Robert nodded. "Yes, sir. And now it's my turn to be honest with you. That bank will not give up easily. They've already filed a case against you. They're claiming your papers are forged." Henry sighed but didn't look surprised. "I expected that. Truth always makes liars nervous." Robert smiled faintly. "Then let's make them nervous in court." A week later, the courthouse was packed. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashed, and townspeople crowded the hallways. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was history being reborn. On one side sat Montgomery First National Bank, with their team of sharp lawyers and polished shoes. On the other side sat Henry Davis, wearing the same old brown hat and carrying his sack, tied neatly with a rope. Beside him stood Robert Collins, calm but alert. When the judge entered, the crowd went silent. The case began. The bank's lead attorney, Mr. Hughes, was tall, confident, and ruthless. He stood up first and began with a mocking tone. "Your Honor," he said loudly, "we are here because this gentleman," he pointed at Henry, "claims to own half of our client's bank, based on documents more than 50 years old. Documents that we believe are nothing more than well-made forgeries," the courtroom murmured. Henry sat still, his hands resting on his sack. Mr. Hughes continued, "We respect this man's age and memory, but this is a modern financial institution, not a fairy tale." Robert stood up slowly. "Your Honor, my client doesn't need fairy tales. He has facts." He walked to the table, opened the sack, and carefully pulled out the same yellowed papers. Everyone leaned forward. The camera flashes sparkled as if history itself was being uncovered. "These," Robert said, "are original contracts, signed by the bank's founders. You will notice each signature has a matching ledger entry in the state archives." He handed them to the judge. Hughes smirked. "If these were real, they'd have been known decades ago." Robert smiled calmly. "Oh, they were known. The founders filed copies but someone made sure they disappeared. Lucky for us, Mr. Davis kept the original safe." He turned to Henry. "Mr. Davis, could you tell the court what happened back then?" Henry stood slowly, leaning on his cane. The courtroom fell silent. "I was 30 when this bank was dying," he began in his calm, deep voice. "The war had taken everything. People were pulling their savings out. The founders came to me because I had land, gold, and crops. They promised me half the shares if I helped them keep the doors open. So I did. I gave them everything I had." He paused, eyes glistening. "My wife Martha told me it was worth it, that helping others meant more than owning land. But after she died, the promises disappeared. The bank grew rich. I just grew old, but I never forgot." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Hughes looked uneasy. Robert spoke softly. "And how did you keep these papers safe all these years?" Henry smiled gently. "In a sack inside the same box my wife kept her Bible. I figured if one truth can save souls, another can save justice." People in the courtroom wiped tears from their eyes. The judge leaned forward, visibly moved. Hughes tried to recover. "Objection, Your Honor. Emotional statements can't prove ownership." The judge raised his hand. "Objection overruled. The evidence is compelling. Continue." Robert turned to his assistant and handed him a folder. "Your Honor, we also have the founder's original ledger, found in state archives last night. It confirms the issuance of 50% shares to Mr. Henry Davis." Hughes's face went pale. "That's impossible." But it wasn't. The truth was there, in black and white. The judge studied the documents for a long moment, then looked at Henry. "Mr. Davis," he said quietly, "I don't think anyone in this court can deny what you've done. You are indeed one of the rightful founders of Montgomery First National Bank. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. People cried. Henry's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled humbly. He looked up toward the ceiling as if speaking to someone unseen. "We did it, Martha," he whispered softly. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just win, sir," he said with pride. "You reminded the world what honesty looks like." And as they left the courtroom, the people stood and clapped for the old man who carried truth in a sack, a man who had been mocked, doubted, and forgotten. Until the day he proved that integrity never grows old. The courtroom victory had shaken the entire city. For the first time in Montgomery's modern history, newspapers were filled not with politics or crime, but with the story of Henry Davis, the old black man who walked into a bank with a sack and walked out owning half of it. Reporters waited outside his little wooden house, trying to get a word from him. Neighbors came with flowers, food, and hugs. Children from nearby streets stopped by, staring at the man who had become a living legend. But Henry, as always, stayed humble. He still woke up before sunrise, made himself a small cup of coffee, and sat on his porch to watch the morning light touch the fields. The world had changed around him, but he hadn't changed one bit. He smiled at the sunrise and whispered, "You see that, Martha? Truth found its way home." A few days later, a black car once again stopped in front of his house. This time, 3 people stepped out. Mrs. Walker, the bank's regional director, Mr. Reed, the manager, and Robert Collins, his lawyer. Mrs. Walker looked nervous. She wasn't wearing her usual confident smile. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Davis," she began, "we finalized the documents. The court's ruling has officially restored your ownership. 50% of Montgomery First National Bank belongs to you." Henry nodded quietly, his face unreadable. Reed cleared his throat. "Sir, that makes you the second largest shareholder. You have a seat on the board of directors effective immediately." Robert looked proud, but Henry seemed thoughtful. He took the papers gently, held them for a moment, then placed them on his lap. "Young man," he said softly, "I never built this bank to sit in fancy meetings or wear gold watches. I built it so people, especially those who had nothing, could have hope. Tell me, has the bank been helping them?" Mrs. Walker lowered her eyes. We've done our best, sir," Henry smiled kindly. "Your best will get better." He stood up slowly, his back straight despite his age. "I'll visit the bank tomorrow, not to take what's mine, but to give it where it's needed most." The next morning, Montgomery First National Bank looked different. The same workers who had once laughed at him now stood in line to greet him respectfully. The guard who had mocked him days ago held the door open, almost bowing his head. Inside, employees whispered as Henry walked past, his brown hat, his dusty coat, and that same old sack swinging gently in his hand. But now those whispers were filled with admiration, not laughter. In the boardroom, the new directors waited. When Henry entered, everyone stood up. The meeting began. Robert introduced him formally. "Gentlemen and ladies, this is Mr. Henry Davis, co-founder and rightful owner of this institution." There was polite applause. Henry smiled humbly and took his seat. He looked around the table. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "You all have important work to do. But I want to talk about something this bank has forgotten. Its heart." Everyone listened silently. "This place was built," he continued, "not just to hold money, but to build lives. Back when we started, people trusted us with their dreams. Farmers, shopkeepers, widows, they came with hope. I want that hope back." He reached into his sack and took out a folded notebook, old and worn. "This is a list of families I've known over the years. Hardworking people who were denied loans because they didn't look qualified. People who lost their homes. Their children still suffer for it." He placed the notebook on the table. "Half of what I own here will go into a new fund. We'll call it the Martha Davis Foundation, in memory of my wife who believed that helping others makes a man truly rich." Mrs. Walker's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Davis, that's beautiful." Henry nodded gently. "Use that money to give small loans to struggling families, to open scholarships for children who can't afford school, and to rebuild homes that storms took away. No interest, no greed, just kindness with a signature." The room was silent. No one moved. Even the walls seemed to listen. Finally, Reed spoke softly. "Sir, you could live the rest of your life as a millionaire." "Why give it all away?" Henry smiled, his eyes shining. Because, son, I've been rich for a long time. I just waited for the world to notice. A few people wiped their eyes. The board voted unanimously to honor his request. The Martha Davis Foundation was created that very day, with Henry Davis as its honorary chairman. Weeks later, the news once again filled the papers. But this time, the headline read, "Bank founder donates half his wealth to help the poor, calls it the real interest of the heart." In small towns across Alabama, people lined up to open accounts again. The bank's reputation soared, not because of its money, but because of its soul. Henry's picture, him sitting on his porch with that brown sack beside him, became a symbol of honesty and faith. When a young reporter asked him what lesson he wanted the world to learn, he smiled and said, "Don't laugh at a man who walks slow. He might be walking toward the truth." That evening, as the sun sank low and golden light filled his yard, Henry sat quietly in his chair, holding a small photograph of his late wife. He whispered softly, "Martha, we did good, didn't we?" And for a moment, as the wind moved through the trees, it almost sounded like her gentle voice saying, "Yes, Henry, you did just fine." Months had passed since the court's ruling, and Montgomery had changed in quiet but powerful ways. People still spoke about the day the old man with the sack walked into the bank and turned laughter into silence. But now they spoke with pride, not mockery. His name, Henry Davis, had become a story parents told their children before bed. The Martha Davis Foundation, which Henry created, had already begun helping people. Small shops reopened, families rebuilt homes, and students from poor backgrounds received scholarships. Every time a loan was approved, every time a child went to school, people whispered, "This is Henry's doing." For the first time in decades, Montgomery's streets felt alive with hope. Every morning, Henry still woke before the sun, just as he had done for 70 years. He would sit on his porch wearing the same hat and holding the same sack, though now it was almost empty. One morning, a group of young students came to his house. They were from the local high school, carrying notebooks and cameras. The leader, a boy no older than 16, stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Davis, sir," he said, "we're making a school project about people who changed our town. Our teacher says you're a hero. Can we interview you?" Henry smiled warmly. "A hero, eh? I don't know about that. I just told the truth," the boy grinned. "Well, that's what makes you a hero, sir." Henry chuckled softly. "All right then, ask your questions." They sat on his porch while he spoke, slowly, humbly, telling them how the bank was built, how promises were broken, and how patience brought the truth home. He didn't use fancy words. He just spoke from his heart. When the interview ended, one girl asked quietly, "Sir, if people treated you badly back then, why didn't you hate them?" Henry looked at her gently. "Hate is a heavy thing, child. Heavier than any sack. If you carry it too long, it breaks your back. I chose to carry hope instead." The children wrote his words down like a sacred lesson. A few days later, the students played their short film at school. It showed Henry's old photos, his humble home, and his gentle voice saying, "Never judge a man by the dust on his shoes." When the film ended, the whole hall stood and clapped. Some teachers had tears in their eyes. The school principal, an elderly man who had once laughed at Henry in his youth, felt a deep ache in his heart. The next day, he visited Henry's house in person. "Mr. Davis," he said quietly, "I came to say something I should have said years ago. I was one of those young fools who laughed when you first came to the bank." "I'm sorry," Henry smiled kindly. "You were young. We all make noise before we learn to listen." The man nodded, eyes wet. "We'd like to name our new library after you. The Henry Davis Learning Hall. Would you allow it?" Henry's eyes widened, then softened. "I never went to school myself," he said softly. "So maybe that's the best honor a man like me could get." Weeks later, the town gathered for the opening ceremony. The mayor, city officials, school children, and townsfolk all stood together. The new library had a bronze plaque by the door that read, "In honor of Henry Davis, who taught us that truth is wealth, and kindness is wisdom." When Henry arrived, everyone clapped. Some people had tears in their eyes, remembering the day they'd mocked him. Now the same people stood proudly beside him, cheering his name. He looked at the plaque for a long time, then whispered to Robert Collins, his lawyer, "I don't need gold or trophies. This right here is enough." Robert smiled. "You gave them more than money, Mr. Davis. You gave them pride." That evening, as the ceremony ended, Henry sat quietly by the river that ran behind the town. The water was calm, reflecting the orange glow of sunset. A young girl from the school approached him shyly. She held a small handmade card. "For you, sir," she said. "I drew this." Henry opened it and smiled. The drawing showed a man with a hat holding a sack standing in front of a big building. Above it, in shaky letters, she had written, "The man who carried truth." Henry looked at the girl and said softly, "You did well, child. Never forget, truth may walk slow, but it never loses its way." The girl nodded and ran back to her mother. That night, Montgomery glowed differently. Lights from the bank, the new library, and the homes that had been rebuilt shimmered like small stars across the town. Inside his house, Henry sat by his window, the sack beside him as always. But now, instead of papers or old coins, it held something else. Thank you letters, cards, and small gifts from the people whose lives he had touched. He touched the sack gently and smiled. "You carried burdens once, old friend," he whispered. "Now you carry blessings." Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, a sound of peace, of gratitude, and of a town that finally remembered its truest son. And as Henry closed his eyes to rest, he whispered one last time, "Martha, my love, the world finally remembers." The morning was quiet and golden when Henry Davis opened his eyes. The air felt softer than usual, like the world itself was moving slower just for him. He sat up in bed and smiled faintly. His joints ached, his back was tired, but his heart was peaceful. It had been almost a year since the courtroom victory, a year since the laughter in Montgomery First National Bank turned into applause. In that time, the Martha Davis Foundation had changed lives across the city. Farmers rebuilt their barns, widows received homes, children wore clean school uniforms. Every corner of town carried his story, spoken in whispers of gratitude. But that morning, Henry felt something different, a quiet pull in his heart. He knew what it meant. It was time to visit the bank. One last time. He dressed carefully, his old brown hat, his clean white shirt, and the same coat he had worn the first day he entered the bank with his sack. He tied the sack once again and slung it gently over his shoulder. It was lighter now, not because it was empty, but because it carried only letters of thanks and blessings from people he had helped. As he stepped outside, the morning sun painted everything in warm light. Children on the street waved at him. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," they shouted. Henry smiled and waved back. "Good morning, little ones. Keep your hearts honest and your shoes steady." He walked slowly toward town, his cane tapping softly on the sidewalk. Shopkeepers came out to greet him. Drivers honked and waved. Even strangers smiled when they saw him. Montgomery had changed, and so had the people. When he reached the tall glass doors of Montgomery First National Bank, the security guard, the same man who once told him to leave, stood straighter and saluted respectfully. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," the guard said warmly. "It's an honor to see you." Henry smiled kindly. "And it's an honor to be seen, son." He stepped inside. The air smelled the same, polished wood, faint perfume, and paper. But now it felt different. The people inside didn't look down on him anymore. They stood up and greeted him like family. "Mr. Davis," the tellers called out. "Good to see you, sir." Henry nodded, smiling at each of them. "Good to see you too, children. You've kept this place shining bright." He made his way to the manager's office. Mr. Reed, now older and gentler, stood up as soon as Henry entered. "Sir," he said, his voice emotional, "you honor us with your presence." Henry chuckled softly. "I've come to make peace with some old walls," he said. Reed gestured toward the window. "Would you like to sit in the boardroom, sir?" Henry shook his head. "No, son. I'd like to sit where it all began, right at that front counter." The manager smiled and nodded. Together they walked to the same counter where, months ago, Henry had once stood holding his sack while people laughed. Now the same counter had a small brass plate fixed into it. It read, "This is where Henry Davis reminded the world what truth looks like." Henry's eyes filled with quiet tears. He ran his wrinkled fingers over the words, then smiled. "That's mighty kind," he said softly. "But the truth don't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who dares to speak it." Reed said gently, "Sir, the entire board wants to thank you. Would you like to address the staff today?" Henry thought for a moment and nodded. "Just a few words. Simple ones. Within minutes, the bank lobby filled with employees, tellers, guards, cleaners, and clerks. Some brought their children just to see the man whose story had become legend. Henry stood before them holding his old sack. "My friends," he began, his voice slow and steady. "This place used to be made of bricks and money. Now it's made of people. That's the real difference." He looked around, meeting every pair of eyes. "Years ago you laughed when an old man came in with a sack. And I don't blame you. The world teaches us to measure people by clothes, not by truth. But truth doesn't wear fine suits. It walks in quietly, carrying patience in its hands." The crowd listened in silence. "I built this bank with hope, not anger," Henry continued. "And when I leave this world, I don't want statues or fame. I just want to know that you'll keep helping those who need a chance, and even when they walk in wearing dust instead of diamonds." A tear rolled down Mr. Reed's cheek. The tellers clapped softly. Even the guards bowed their heads. Henry smiled and tapped his sack gently. "And this old friend here," he said, lifting it slightly, "has carried everything, my burdens, my dreams, my truth. But now I think it's time I leave it here. This sack belongs to the bank, same as the story does." He handed the brown sack to Mr. Reed, who took it with trembling hands. "We'll keep it safe, sir," he promised. Henry nodded. "Keep it visible, son. Let it remind everyone that even the poorest man might be carrying something worth more than gold." That afternoon, when Henry left the bank, the whole staff followed him outside. The townspeople passing by stopped and clapped as he walked down the steps. The golden sunlight fell over him like a blessing. Robert Collins, his lawyer and friend, stood waiting near the car. "You look peaceful, sir," he said softly. Henry smiled. "Because I am. I gave this place everything I had and got back more than I ever dreamed." Robert nodded. "You gave them faith, Mr. Davis," Henry chuckled gently. "Faith in a story worth telling." As he turned to look at the bank one last time, he whispered quietly, "Goodbye, old friend." Then he put on his hat, took one last deep breath of the warm Alabama air, and walked slowly home, leaving behind a legend that would outlive him forever. The days grew shorter, and the air turned cool as autumn arrived in Montgomery. The leaves painted the streets gold and red, falling softly on sidewalks where children once ran past Henry Davis's little wooden house shouting, "Good morning, Mr. Davis." Now they passed quietly, knowing the old man inside needed rest. Henry had grown weaker, but his mind was sharp as ever. Each morning he still sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise over the town he had changed forever. The brown sack was no longer on his shoulder. It rested in the bank's glass display case, seen by hundreds every week. People touched the glass gently, whispering his name as if it were sacred. Henry smiled every time someone mentioned it. "That old sack carried my truth," he would say softly, "and now it carries hope for others." One chilly evening, his dear friend Robert Collins came to visit. The lawyer had become more like a son to him. He brought a wool blanket, a box of medicine, and a warm smile. "Evening, sir," Robert said gently. Henry looked up from his chair. "Evening, son. Sit down. You look tired from saving the world." Robert laughed softly. "You're the one who saved it first." They talked for a while, about the foundation, the families helped, and the new library that bore his name. When the room grew quiet, Henry said, "Robert, do you know what peace feels like?" Robert frowned slightly. "I suppose it feels like no more worries." Henry smiled faintly. "It feels like knowing you did what you came here to do." There was silence for a moment. The old man's voice trembled as he continued. "My time's almost done, son. When I'm gone, promise me something." Robert leaned forward. "Anything, sir." "Don't let them forget," Henry whispered. "Not about me and about the truth. About what honesty can build when money can't." Robert swallowed hard. "I promise." Henry reached for an envelope resting on the table. "Then take this. It's my last letter. When the time comes, read it to them and at the bank." Robert hesitated. "You make it sound like you're leaving soon." Henry chuckled softly. "Son, we're all leaving soon. Some of us just pack lighter." The next morning was quiet, too quiet. The sun rose slowly, but Henry didn't open his door. His neighbor, an old woman who often brought him breakfast, knocked gently. When he didn't answer, she peeked through the window. He was still sitting in his chair, head resting peacefully to the side, a soft smile on his lips. The cup of tea beside him was cold. Word spread through Montgomery like a whisper carried by the wind. Henry Davis had passed away in his sleep. The news hit everyone deeply. The town stopped. Shops closed early. Schools held moments of silence, and church bells rang for the man who had once been mocked, then admired, then loved. 3 days later, the funeral was held at the same church Henry had attended with his late wife, Martha, decades ago. The wooden benches were full. People stood outside, hundreds of them, bankers, farmers, teachers, children, all united by one man's truth. Robert Collins stood near the front, holding Henry's final letter. When the pastor nodded, Robert stepped up to the pulpit. His voice was steady but heavy with emotion. He opened the letter carefully. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. "To my friends, Ho," he began reading. "If you're hearing this, then I've gone home to see Martha again. Don't be sad. A life is like a field. You plow it, plant it, and one day you rest in it." The church was silent. Robert continued, "I didn't come into this world to own banks or wear fine suits. I came to remind people that a promise still matters, that truth still has value. If I left you anything, it's not money. It's proof that no man is too small to make things right." Robert's voice broke slightly, but he went on. "So when you walk past the bank, don't look at the glass or the gold inside. Look at that old sack. And remember, sometimes everything worth saving fits inside something that looks worthless." A quiet sob came from the back row. Robert finished softly. "Tell them to be kind, to be fair, and to be patient. That's the real interest that never runs out. Yours truly, Henry Davis." The whole room stood as the choir began to sing a slow hymn, the same one played at Martha's funeral years before. Tears fell freely, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of pride. After the service, the townspeople followed Henry's casket to the small cemetery near the river. The bank staff carried it with their own hands, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Walker, and others who had once doubted him. They laid him beside Martha, under a tall oak tree. The breeze whispered softly through the leaves as if heaven itself was welcoming him home. On his tombstone, the words were simple, just as he would have wanted. Henry Davis, 1872-1951. He carried truth in a sack and left the world richer. That evening, the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky gold one last time for him, and as the first stars appeared, Montgomery's people lit candles on their porches, one for every life Henry had touched. The man who once walked into a bank alone had left behind a whole town glowing with light. Years passed like quiet pages turning in a book. The town of Montgomery changed, but the name Henry Davis never faded. His story became more than a tale. It became a lesson whispered from one generation to the next. Children grew up hearing about the old black man who walked into a bank with a sack and walked out owning half of it. But more than that, they learned what it meant to stand for truth, even when the world laughs at you. The Martha Davis Foundation kept growing. It built new schools, funded college scholarships, and supported small families who had nothing but dreams. Every time a new grant was approved, a portrait of Henry and his wife hung in the background. Two humble faces smiling down on those who dared to hope. And inside the main branch of Montgomery First National Bank, there stood a glass case right by the entrance. Inside it, under warm lights, rested the same old brown sack. On the plaque beneath it read, "This sack once carried papers. Now it carries a man's truth." In memory of Henry Davis, 1872-1951, every visitor stopped there. Some bowed their heads, others placed their hands on the glass. For some it was history. For others it was faith made visible. It was a bright spring morning, decades later, when a young boy named Eli Carter entered the bank with his mother. He was 10 years old, wearing a school uniform and holding a crumpled homework sheet. "Mom," he whispered, staring at the sack in the display. "Is that the one?" His mother smiled softly. "Yes, baby. That's the one Mr. Davis carried." "Did he really own the bank?" She knelt beside him. "He owned more than that. He owned respect. And that's something no money can buy." The boy's eyes lit up. "I want to be like him." She kissed his forehead. "Then tell the truth, even when no one believes you." Eli nodded, pressing his little palm against the glass. The reflection of his hand touched the old sack, and for a moment, it felt like two generations shaking hands. That afternoon, at Henry Davis Elementary School, A new building built from the foundation's donations. The teachers began their lesson. On the chalkboard, in neat white letters, it read, "Lesson of the day, the man who carried truth." The teacher, an older woman with kind eyes, began softly. Henry Davis was not born rich. He was born with nothing but courage. And sometimes courage is enough to change the world. The children listened wide-eyed as she told the story, how he sold his land, how he was laughed at, and how he proved that promises and honesty never grow old. One girl raised her hand. "Miss Parker, did Mr. Davis ever get famous?" The teacher smiled. "He didn't want fame, child. He wanted fairness. That's what made him great." The room fell silent as those simple words sank deep into their hearts. Across town, Robert Collins, now gray-haired and walking with a cane of his own, stood at Henry's grave. He came every year on the same day, bringing fresh flowers and reading the same Bible verse aloud. He placed the flowers gently beneath the oak tree and said softly, "You were right, sir. They didn't forget." He looked around at the peaceful cemetery, the wind moving gently, sunlight filtering through the leaves. "You built something stronger than walls," he whispered. "You built faith." Then, as he turned to leave, he noticed something new. Someone had left a little toy sack at the grave, handmade from brown cloth tied with string. A note beside it read, "Dear Mr. Davis, I want to carry truth like you did. Eli, age 10. Robert smiled, his eyes misty. "And so it continues," he whispered. Over the next few decades, the Henry Davis Scholarship sent hundreds of students to universities. Some became doctors, some teachers, others community leaders. Every one of them carried his story in their hearts. One of them, a young woman named Lena Carter, great-granddaughter of Eli, became the new manager of Montgomery First National Bank. On her first day in office, she stood before the glass case, looking at the old brown sack. Her reflection shimmered in the glass as if Henry himself were standing beside her. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Mr. Davis. You didn't just save this bank. You taught us what wealth really means." That day, she announced a new policy. Every month, one family in need would receive interest-free financial help. In honor of Henry Davis's legacy, the news spread quickly. The town cheered. Reporters once again wrote about the man whose truth still shaped the city long after his passing. On a summer evening years later, the townsfolk gathered at the riverbank, near where Henry and Martha were buried. They held candles that flickered gently in the breeze. The choir sang softly and children read short lines from his story. As the final song ended, the mayor spoke. "Montgomery remembers a man who walked into this town with nothing but honesty. He built not just a bank, but a belief that kindness and truth are the greatest riches on earth." The crowd bowed their heads. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the oak leaves above Henry's grave. For a brief moment it sounded like quiet laughter, gentle, familiar, peaceful, somewhere beyond the clouds. Perhaps Henry and Martha smiled together, proud of the world they had helped to mend. And down below, in the little town that once laughed at him, truth kept walking, steady, patient, unshakable, just as he once did. The end.